Thank you, Aku. Like Aku mentioned, I will just briefly go over the changes to the WADA code that affect you as coaches directly or that affect you indirectly by the sanctions on your players. With the new code, there have been a lot of changes that greatly affect coaches. It's a bit different than the old code. They want to hold coaches a bit more responsible if they were somehow involved with a doping violation of their player. First of all, coaches are considered athlete support personnel according to the code. An athlete support personnel is any person working with, treating, or assisting a player participating in or preparing for sports competitions. So coaches are 100% considered in this group. Your responsibilities include you must be knowledgeable and comply with all anti-doping rules which apply to you or your player. It's a big code. It's a lot to be responsible for. But ultimately, ignorance is no excuse of the law. So if you don't know the rule, that will not be an excuse if a violation is charged against you. You should share information with the respective anti-doping organization. That includes the IIHF if it's at an international competition. It would be the national federation at a national competition or your national anti-doping organization. You have to share all anti-doping violations that you suspect are occurring, or you must cooperate, and you must cooperate with all investigations that are going on by your national anti-doping organization or by the IIHF. If you do not do this, it's technically against the code, and a violation, anti-doping violation, can be charged against you. There are longer bans. This is probably the most significant change to the 2015 code. Players who deliberately cheat using doping substances such as anabolic steroids, growth hormones, will be sanctioned with a 4-year ban. The old code was 2 years. This is a huge difference. This is the end of a player's career if he's sanctioned with a 4-year ban. Players who refuse or evade testing will be sanctioned with a 4-year ban. Evading, according to the code, is if your player doesn't go directly to doping control and he does not have a reason for doing so. Can be sanctioned now rather than 2 years, but with a 4-year ban. And while this has not changed, there was a lot of controversy with the amendment of the new code to get rid of doping and careless supplemental use. That was not approved, so now, as in before, inadvertent doping through careless supplement use, your player takes a recovery substance, will be sanctioned with 2 years. Athlete support personnel and use of prohibited substances, you guys can no longer use any prohibited substance or any prohibited method unless you have a valid reason for doing so. So the entire prohibited list, all of the methods, you can no longer use those. If you are doing so, you must have a valid justification for doing so. This is brand new. Before, the prohibited list never applied to coaches, but now it applies equally to coaches. These are new anti-doping rule violations. If you are involved in an anti-doping rule violation, if you're helping to cover something up, you know something, it's a good player, you don't want him to be sanctioned, and you help him evade this, you will be sanctioned in the same manner that he is. So therefore, if you have a player that's taken an anabolic steroid, you find out about this, you help him cover this up, you will also be sanctioned with 4 years. That means you can no longer participate in any type of ice hockey related activity. Second, players associating with a coach who has been found guilty of an anti-doping rule violation or similar criminal or disciplinary offense will be sanctioned with a ban. I'm sure all of you are aware of your TUEs for your players. If your player is taking a substance via a prescription or a doctor's orders to participate in the competition, if it's a prohibited substance, he must have a therapeutic use exemption. Whereas before, there was always some confusion. If you have a national TUE, does the IIHF recognize that? Now, if you have a nationally granted TUE for your player, the IIHF must recognize that, unless we have extreme reasons for doing so that do not fall in line with the international standards. Speaking with our committee, unless it's really far out there why your player has this substance or why the National Anti-Doping Organization granted it, the IIHF will recognize the TUE of the National Anti-Doping Organization. Further, sorry, I skipped them. If you have an under 18 player that has been found guilty of an anti-doping rule violation, it is 100% mandatory that the IIHF does an investigation into you. You could have had absolutely nothing to do with it, but we will have to investigate you to determine whether or not you could have or could not have influenced the player taking the substance. Then contaminated products. I mentioned before that I'm sure you guys are all aware, a lot of times a supplement will have can be contaminated with a product. While WADA was amending the code, there were several amendments so players could completely get out of if it's a contaminated product. However, the WADA decided not to allow this, that the players will ultimately still be sanctioned, even if it's a contaminated product, even if they can prove that they took a supplement with no prohibited substance in it, and it was inadvertently contaminated by a prior batch at the manufacturer, they will still be at least sanctioned with a reprimand, but they will not receive the 2 years. And then this is also new in the code with respect to your players who have already been sanctioned, whereas before they could not participate in any ice hockey activity until their end of their suspension. Now they can return to team training, the shorter of 1, the last 2 months of the player's period of ineligibility, or 2, the last 1/4 of the period of ineligibility imposed. These are the major changes which the IIHF has determined affect coaches the most or have the potential to affect coaches. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, ultimately you guys are responsible for knowing everything in the code. It's a lot, but if you guys have any questions, you can always address them to myself or Aku at the office at any time. But I always advise, if you're suspecting a player, find out what's going on. If you have a question, don't wait, because it's your career, and you don't want to be caught inadvertently for a player that is on your team for doping. So it's better just to be safe.